I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar and thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, just a quick introduction on Tulip. Tulip provides a frontline operation platform that's really focused on companies around the world, helping them to equip their frontline workforce with becoming more operationally efficient, more productive, and focused on driving higher quality in their organizations. We will cover a little bit more about Tulip later, but with that, we'll kick this off and get started. As we look at the agenda for today, we have a lot to cover. We're going to do our best to get through this in the next 45 minutes and allow some time for Q&A. But our focus is to start with the current state of MES today. Really thinking about some of the positive attributes of deploying a traditional MES, as well as some of the challenges that we face when we deploy those systems. We'll then move over into predictions, talking about emerging trends and things that we think are important as you look at your next generational set of technologies. And then finally, how do we rethink MES and why a next-gen MES is necessary, at least the way we see it and what we believe for manufacturers and operators around the globe. Just a quick further introduction on myself before we really get into this. Again, I'm Jason Dietrich. I'm the head of commercial operations at Tulip. As noted, I've been doing this a long time. Hopefully my experience in the MES market is valuable as we go through this deck today and this discussion. I currently lead sales at Tulip, as well as our customer services, customer support, and customer success teams. Erik, please introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks, everyone, for joining today. My name's Erik Mirandette, lead our product and ecosystem teams here at Tulip. Been with Tulip since coming out of lab, back in 2015, 2014. So sort of been along for the whole journey. Prior to product and ecosystem, I led our operations team, and prior to that, did a lot of our early BD, some of our early sales work. I'm excited to share some of the things we've been talking about. This is a theme that has come up time and time again. It's a conversation we've had many times, and I think that there's a lot of interesting things happening in the space today that warrant the conversation. So I'm really looking forward to unpacking this with the audience today.
Great, thanks, Erik. So with that, let's take a step back and think about the current state of MES today. We want to start off on a positive note and talk about the things that are working with an MES system that's been deployed, in many of your companies. And the way I'd start by saying is, MES companies have been around, since the early 90s. They've been deployed across a wide variety of verticals. There's a trustworthiness from those decades of being the default solution. Companies who've deployed MES, you kind of know what you know. You have an expectation of a certain set of functionality. You have an expectation that there will be vertical expertise, with some of these MES solutions. If you're in a certain environment that requires regulatory compliance, you have assurances that you'll meet those stringent conditions. And ultimately, what happens is an MES solves a really important problem, which is supporting operations, helping to track and document the dispatch from raw materials to finished goods and all things that happen in between, and really provide that traceability and genealogy of how we manufacture things. So over the last 30 years, these systems have been critical for companies to manufacture the goods that they provide to the market. So certainly some positive attributes there from the history of these being deployed. Erik, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, Jason, it reminds me, I was, a few years ago, I was at a conference and we were talking about Tulip. It was a very different stage, in Tulip's journey. And we were talking about, I was taking the stage immediately after somebody who was representing an MES system. I don't recall which one, but, it was an interactive session, relatively small crowd. And he went out and he sort of talked about all the points that you just made about, the problems that MES solves. And the audience, I think there were some people, I don't know if they were seated or what, there were some folks who had bad experiences rolling out an MES, right? It's not an easy thing to do. And they were pretty critical of some of the assurances that, that were being made in that particular presentation. And the fact of the matter is that, the speaker said, look, all of that is valid. It's hard to roll out. These things are challenging. It's cumbersome. You're kind of locked into what you have. And there's challenges with it. We acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, look, it's a critical problem, and there's really no other way to solve it. And the fact of the matter is, it gets the job done oftentimes. And that was kind of like the final point there. Now, it happened to make a pretty good segue into the topic that I was about to talk about, which is introducing the concept of Tulip at that time. But the fact of the matter is, like, look, this has been around for a while. People are using it, and it solves critical problems for folks. Now, obviously, we have a position on, how is this changing, and how could you think about some of these challenges in a slightly different way? But I don't want to. Jason, same as you, I think we don't want to just gloss over the fact that this is and has been an important part of the infrastructure for a lot of these manufacturing operations for a long time.
No, full agree. Thanks for that. So as we move into the challenges that manufacturers face with MES, we wanted to highlight 4 key areas that we feel have been these challenges. And hopefully, as we talk about next gen, we think about how we face those challenges head on. So the first one we wanted to cover was, siloed systems and sites. And, when I think about deploying MES and I think about how I've done it over the years, what you find is you have a system, you deploy it at a given site, you get to the next site, there's requirements that are different, you end up changing or customizing the next site. And you do that on a repeated basis. And what you find is it's hard to deploy across the enterprise. It's hard to maintain because they become different variations of the same system. But most importantly, what I found is, in that entire, deployment, the operator experience can be negative in that they weren't developed, at their core to support an enterprise rollout of a consistent solution that operators across that enterprise can use in a consistent fashion. So, you end up with this environment where you have silos across an enterprise.
Yeah, and if I could just talk a little bit about, one of the challenges that I see frequently when I'm on site with customers that either have an MES or talking with customers who have implemented MESs in the past, it can be very difficult to get real-time data from these systems. That can be a result of a couple of different factors, but traditionally these are pretty good at telling you what went wrong yesterday, last week, last month. Much harder to use these systems to understand and provide that feedback loop to the shop floor about what requires action right now. Where are things? Where are you incurring inefficiencies? Where are you incurring defects that can be avoided? So it becomes more of a reporting tool and less of a decision-making tool. So this can be, a real challenge with MES, kind of in its current conception. And I suppose related to that is this challenge of, MES systems are by design not very flexible, and why is that the case? I mean, you typically will start with, when you're looking at an MES system, it typically starts with a process of gathering requirements, with understanding the specification of the system as it's supposed to be, and then, customizing, as you mentioned, customizing that system to meet the needs, or at least as the needs are sort of conceived of the process, and then at the end of the day, rolling that out, turning it on with kind of a big bang approach, and then you have what you have, and it's very difficult to make those changes. There's a couple of problems with that. I think the first is, in the way you do this, oftentimes requires customizing the core functionality and code of that MES system, which means that every site you have, and this relates to the first theme, is actually running on a different code base, which makes it really difficult if there's an improvement or an upgrade or new functionality or new modules. It gets very difficult to incorporate those within the individual sites, certainly very difficult to incorporate those upgrades across the whole of the enterprise. And the second problem here is that, we don't, there in software development, there's this notion of the mythical requirement, and the idea here is that, these are complex systems that we're operating within, and the reality is that no one person really understands what's happening across the entirety of that system at any given point in time. Now, even if they did, to add to that, these are also dynamic systems. Product A sells, product B doesn't. You have a supply chain challenge. The fact of the matter is that these manufacturing operations are constantly adapting and evolving to take into account the changing conditions within which they operate. And MES, as it's constructed, again, on that rigid data model, does not lend itself to this type of agility. And I think increasingly we're seeing that be a business imperative for at least our customers.
No, it's great. Thanks. I think as we look at the last area of this in our challenges section, one of the things that we really believe in is this idea that we want a company to own their system, own their deployment, own what it takes to make them successful. And traditional MES solutions require, a heavy reliance on the vendor. And it's not just the vendor that's providing the software technology, but also reliance on third-party integration companies, et cetera, to help maintain, deploy, own, iterate, over the life of that solution. So we find it becomes expensive, to deploy, expensive to own over the total cost of ownership. And again, having that overall reliance and not being able to really control your own destiny. And to some of the other points we've talked about, with the end game being whatever we deploy, we want it to be deployed across the enterprise in a common way, in a maintainable way. So as we circle back later, we'll talk about these challenges again, and we'll talk about areas that we think next gen MES can help take care of these challenges.
Okay, so with that, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about given these challenges, giving some of the new capabilities that are being made available to industry, what are our predictions? So I think generally speaking, there's really three key themes that we're thinking about when we're talking about our predictions for MES. The first is, whatever the solution that's going to be implemented it needs to take a human-centric approach, and it needs to be thinking about the reality of those frontline operations professionals as a foremost consideration, not as a secondary afterthought. The second is that they've got to work. And when I mean work, I don't mean function. I mean, they've got to do work, right? So at the end of the day, these systems are here to help our customers and help industry operate more effectively and produce equipment more efficiently. And so that needs to be a foremost consideration here. And the last is related to business growth. We're operating in a very difficult set of circumstances globally. I mean, there's COVID, there's, supply chain disruptions left and right. We've all lived this reality for a couple of years. I don't need to, reiterate it. But the fact of the matter is that, manufacturing customers are looking for new areas of business, revenue generation, and the manufacturing systems that are being implemented need to be able to support that pursuit. So first, picking up on that first theme, human centricity. What does it mean to have an operation, a manufacturing system that is human centric? We've all heard of the Great Resignation. Well, we've all experienced the challenges in operating amid the Great Resignation. People are increasingly have options when they're looking at what they want to do professionally. And if you look at what's happening in industry a little bit more broadly, a lot of the low-hanging fruit for automation has been automated. What that means is that people are increasingly being asked to do things that are more complex in nature, that require additional information to make the right decision. And I mean, it's, I think, frankly, a very positive thing. There's challenges associated with it, certainly when we look at the availability of labor and such. But at the end of the day, what we're seeing is a transition to where the things that computers do particularly well, computers are doing many of those things. The things that humans do particularly well, which is assimilate new information and make decisions quickly. We're going to continue to see this trend. So that means whatever these manufacturing systems are going to be are going to need to operate in light of this reality. And I suppose to add a little bit more color to that, everyone's aware of the Great Resignation. What does that actually look like for manufacturing? So this is came out in Q4 or late in 2021. This is a jobs report that shows change in, I think we're calling them quits. These are people who voluntarily left their employment, broken down by industry. And what you can see is that manufacturing, of those surveyed, saw the greatest increase in the number of people who voluntarily left the industry, left their job to seek employment elsewhere. An increase of almost 2x, so 75% increase year over year. So, I mean, this is not theoretical. This is like the reality in which we're all operating. And I made a comment earlier about like a lot of the low hanging fruit of automation has already been automated. I think about this. Have you guys? I don't know. Maybe you remember. I think of Tesla. Back when Elon Musk was talking. This is maybe 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago now, about the Model 3 production, and there was a comment that that took the headlines that said, and it was the characterization. He said, "I want to be able to walk up to the Model 3 factory and turn a big dial, and I want Model 3s to come out faster when I do that." Right? Idea being that the whole thing would be automated, minimal reliance on humans. Well, fast forward, as you may recall, through what the headlines called production hell, right? And it literally existentially threatened Tesla. Like it threatened the core business. They almost went out of business as a result of this. And then fast forward through production hell. Now this is a very common. I see Model 3s in the parking lot outside. I think I saw like 2 or 3 of them on the way in here. They're all over the road. But what was the learning there? And what the washout was is that there was an over reliance on automation, and they simply were automating things that didn't make sense to automate, right? And so I think the point here is that by intelligently combining automation to do the things that they do well with while elevating the human component within these environments, within these operations, that's how you're going to see these these efficiency gains. And in case it's not abundantly clear to everyone, this is saying 40% of organizations are going to blend virtual and physical experiences. I think the point here is, we all live. Software is a part of our everyday lives. We use software to talk to our loved ones on our phones, via text message or voice. We use it to do our banking. We use it to manage our calendar. We rely on software, some virtual experience, to manage virtually every aspect of our life. You can't have a conversation about running a manufacturing operation or improving the efficiency of a manufacturing operation that is divorced from this reality. And so any conversation we have about how do we improve efficiencies within industry, there's an element of software that needs to play a role there, and that's becoming increasingly apparent and will continue to become increasingly apparent.
Great, thanks, Erik. I'll cover prediction 2 here, which is Agile is and will be more important than ever in manufacturing. And tying back to what Erik said earlier, if you think about business growth opportunities and companies, seeking ways to generate new revenue streams, think about ways of being more productive, more efficient. The first thing, any business has to be able to do is react to disruptive events. And I would say over the last almost 2 years now, many businesses have been disrupted in a way they've never envisioned previously. Supply chain disruption, new demand, curves, the need to be more agile in terms of how they manufacture, how they produce, having to be able to do that in a much, increased pace of adoption, needing real-time information to be able to drive, workflows that help the operator have the right information at the right time. So when we think about Agile, there used to be this world of manufacturing where there was some level of consistency. You had consistency in your supply chain. You had manufacturing lines that were set up and could be run a certain way for a certain period of time. In some cases, many months, years, even decades run the same way. That's all been flipped on its head. Companies have to be agile, and whatever solutions they deploy have to be agile. And I'll kind of close with cloud adoption. Again, seeing MES systems for a very long time and how they've been deployed, as well as other tools in the industrial automation world. The idea of putting those in the cloud, 5 to 10 years ago was a complete non-starter. And what I'd say now is it's not only happening, it's necessary to happen. An architecture going forward has to include the cloud. So the adoption now is no longer a nice to have, it's certainly a necessity. And tying back to business growth and agility, 74% of CFOs are concerned with lower profitability because of margin pressure. Those same CFOs are responding by trying to raise prices on customers. Raising prices on customers is not really a long-term solution. At some point, the curve there of increased prices is going to affect demand. So, what we believe is the CFOs, the folks who are running manufacturing facilities, who run their operational settings, they're focused on productivity and efficiency, because ultimately these changes that impact their business, they have to drive towards profitability, and they need solutions that are going to, improve that margin and, eliminate these margin pressures, and therefore allow kind of supply and demand curves to even out over time. And then finally, just hammering home the idea of the cloud. Gartner notes here that by 2025, cloud native platforms will serve as the foundation for more than 95% of new digital initiatives, up from less than 40%. So again, I would probably argue if they went back 5 years, that 40% was 5 or 10%. Now it's 40%, expecting to drive towards close to 100%, over the next couple of years. And we're certainly seeing that as people are looking at next gen MES solutions.
And if I could talk a little bit about some of the changes we're seeing in the workforce and the tools that people are comfortable in using. So our third prediction here is that you're going to continue to see an increase in no-code, low-code solutions that democratize the tools that allow people to run these operations. If you look at the folks who are entering the work space today, these are all digital natives. These folks grew up with the internet. They grew up with smartphones, and they grew up on Facebook and Instagram and all of these things. They're comfortable using these types of tools. Not only are they comfortable using it, they expect it. They don't know how to do work in any other way. I'm reminded of this. I was talking to an engineer. He had entered the workforce, within the last 5 years or so, and it was, I was talking with him anyway, and he was like, we're talking with him about Tulip and everything, and I said, well, what are you looking for? Why is Tulip interesting to you? And he said, in disbelief, he said, I showed up on my first day at the job with a supercomputer in my hand, and the more senior tenure engineer that was responsible for the operation that was onboarding him was like, look, get the steel toes on, grab this checklist and a piece of, and a pencil, and put that thing away, because we've got to do work, right? And it just like, not only do we have to do work, we have to solve a complex data problem in the context of a complex adaptive system, which is a manufacturing operation, right? And he was just dumbfounded. He was like, you're going to take away my most valuable tool, this thing that I have that allows me to collect information real time and process that information and extract relevant insights, and you're asking me to go back to pen and paper to solve these problems. And it was like it was just completely dumbfounding to him. And I think increasingly, like, this is what we're seeing. 5 years ago, this was a little bit avant-garde. This was a little bit progressive. Now, this is just how people think and how people do work. And the prediction here and the point here is that these tools are increasingly becoming mainstream, and the folks entering the workforce, given, there's a lot of folks leaving the workforce, which we talked about, the people who are replacing them and picking up the torch and continuing the fight. These folks grew up using these tools, and we're going to continue to see the proliferation of these tools, as we think about how to run and increase efficiencies within our manufacturing operations. And this, I suppose, is a statistic that further supports the claim that I just made. This stuff is everywhere, and you're also seeing it being used in all sorts of adjacent industries already. From workflow management to CRM to daily task management and the like. So again, these tools are becoming increasingly available, and they have I think an important role to play in industry. Now, the last prediction we're making is that we've seen a ton of new technologies land in the market, and you can think about the Gartner hype cycle. There's lots of new capabilities coming available, but it's important that we don't lose focus on how is value created. There's a lot of shiny objects, there's a lot of cool things, and as technology advances every day, like, the number of available options and the number of available things you could do will continue to increase. But the question isn't, how can I adopt this cool new tech? Whether that be, wearables, whether that be augmented reality interfaces, whether that be, and the list goes on. The latest IIoT or big data buzzword, or AI ML models. All of these are legitimate. All of them have legitimate use cases. But the question isn't how do you what we sort of like to call is like the buzzword bingo, and we sometimes get on these calls and it's like who can get bingo first. But the question isn't like how many of these can you incorporate. The question is like what are the fundamental technologies that allow you to eliminate waste from your process, right? And so these are going to continue to become increasingly available. And the point here is that it's important that we don't lose track of where value is really created, and that we, it's like, Vince Lombardi said, football is about blocking and tackling. Improving manufacturing operations is about improving process and eliminating waste, right? And these technologies could play an important role in that, but they should never be an end in of themselves.
Yeah, and I think I'll add, Erik, too, is I think these technologies aren't a one size fits all, and they're also really dependent upon where you are in your own journey. So depending on what solutions you've deployed, depending on the size company you are, depending on what your outcomes are, to Erik's point, it's all about driving value and deploying technologies that are a potential fit or maybe a misfit just to implement, isn't really what we want to do here. We want to drive value. We want to look at solutions that fit our future architecture. And again, just kind of highlighting that, a new technology may work very well for a certain vertical, for a certain size company, and may not work well at all for a different vertical, for a different size company. And I just think we want to, keep that in the back of our minds as we think about deploying these technologies.
Which leads us to this point here about the composability of manufacturing systems. The composability of approaches to these complex problems more generally, right? The idea is that in the context of a complex dynamic system, which I think pretty accurately describes any manufacturing operation, there isn't a single static set of requirements that can be understood, that can be built, that you can build a system that perfectly satisfies those, that is then implemented. Never mind the fact that between requirements gathering and actual implementation can conservatively take several months, realistically take a year or more. But the point here is that in the context of a system that is constantly changing and a business that is constantly adapting to a changing environment around it, this idea of having a democratized set of tools and a composable approach to understanding and improving those operations is going to be increasingly important. I've seen the trend over the previous few years, and we feel strongly that this is going to continue to be the case.
Great, thanks, Erik, for that. So, what we want to do now is kind of turn the page to the final section of our agenda, and it's really rethinking MES and why we believe a next-gen MES is necessary for you to achieve the goals that you have as a manufacturing and operational, entity. So we wanted to come back and circle back to, the four challenges we noted earlier and why traditional MES won't cut it. And my view here simply is, we have manual reporting and a frustration and loss of data. As people have deployed these site by site, not across the enterprise, it's been hard to build out your data architecture. It's been hard to ingest that data in a meaningful way. It's been hard to have consistency from site to site. We're seeing increased waste and again, hindering the ability to grow by this delayed data, by not giving the right information at the right time. The idea of, complex, pricing and implementation, the inability to adapt. We go back to that the feeling of, needing the agility to be able to flex as business conditions are changing. And then ultimately, layers of permissions and bureaucracy delaying action and ROI, not being flexible, not being agile, that reliance on vendors. And, ultimately, these critical challenges are being faced by people trying to deploy MES. And we think as we talk here in the next few slides about the future of and how next-gen MES can support, really eliminating these challenges, or at least making it easier for you to deploy. Erik, do you have any further thoughts on this?
Yeah, if I could just add, Jason, I think about when I think about this sort of where the industry is and where the state of MES is, I'm reminded, if you think of 100 years ago, how you built a manufacturing operation, you basically had to start. This isn't the time before electric motors, right? You basically had to start by finding a big river and then building a big water wheel that would convert mechanical energy from the water using gravity, and then run that through a large shaft, and then distribute that mechanical energy to a system of belts and spinning rods, which would then be distributed to each of the individual lathes and cutting tools that would be positioned within this facility, right? Which means, and it's hard, it's like crazy to think about. It's crazy to think that anything was ever built in that way, which at the time was like transformative, right? But what it means is that you had to know how many cutting tools you wanted, where they were going to go, what they were going to do, and that which dramatically limited what you could produce before you ever laid the first brick of that facility, right? And now it's crazy to think about because no one would ever dream of making a manufacturing facility in that way, and no one ever has to. And the reason for that is because we now have the ability to decentralize the distribution of this power, and we do that by means of an electric motor. I'm in a building with 5 or 6 massive DMG Mori CNC machines, about 30 feet on the other side of that wall, and each of them, you could drop those things anywhere, given that the electrical infrastructure was in place, and they can do exponentially more than you would have ever been able to conceive when you were operating in that type of environment. And what occurs to me is that the way we think about our manufacturing IT stack sure feels very, very similar to the way that we used to have to think about the physical building, right? You have to know, what are you going to build? What's the process? What data do we want? Where is that data going to go? And you have to solve all of those problems before you ever enter your first field into the system, before you ever get any analytics out of the system. And the point here is, that's changing, and there's no going back once it does. And we have some ideas, and we've seen, they're not, as I said, theoretical. Like we're seeing customers adopt a composable approach to manufacturing systems that really kind of put this paradigm on its head for how you would think about building these systems and how they're constructed and the role of the citizen developer therein. That I think we're excited to share with you in the next couple of slides. But that's the mental model I have when I read this slide and I see these challenges.
No, I think it's a great correlation there. No, thanks for that example. So that brings us to rethinking MES and investing in those workers, productivity initiatives, business growth. What are some of the areas that we believe are critical? So there's 6 things we've noted here. I'm just going to quickly hit them. Number 1, making sure we are addressing the workforce, improving employee retention, giving them something that they're proud of and that they feel like they're always learning. Having innovation, democratization, citizen development, putting this in the hands of people who are actually doing the work, give them the ability as operational technologists to build things. Low risk pilot implementation, this idea of when you're rethinking MES, how can you do something that quickly proves value, proves that it meets the needs, and then you can easily roll this across your site, your lines, your enterprise. You have to have something that's agile and accounts for supply chain management and demand fluctuations, this idea of keeping up to the pace of change. You have to be able to address scaling pains. So again, anybody that I think is looking at their next gen MES should be thinking about, how does it fit this cell or this line? But more importantly, how does it fit the rest of my factory and the rest of my extended factories and supply chain? And ultimately, will this solution help you stay competitive and relevant by adopting the right level of new technology? Not just deploying technology for technology's sake, but something that's proving value for your organization. So the one area we wanted to spend a little bit more time on is Erik's going to take us through the concept of a low-risk pilot implementation, maybe versus traditional MES.
Yeah, and we're starting to get questions pouring in here, so I want to make sure we save time for those. I'm going to go through this sort of quickly, but the idea, like we talked a little bit about the requirements gathering process, the vendor selection process, the configuration customization of the MES system that's going to be rolled out, and then the actual rollout of that system, which is when you get your first field. That's when you first get your first data, and that's where value is created. And we're talking a lot about this notion of a composable approach. The way we think about this at Tulip is very different, right? So we don't have a big bang moment where you flip a switch and the system goes online. We start you can start very small. You can take a single cell or a single station or a single line, and you can start with problems that you want to solve. You don't have to have the whole end state in mind, and you can start by building a suite of applications or an application that addresses a very specific problem, and then roll it out. You can do this literally. I've done these workshops many times. What we typically do, once people understand the tool, we'll go and we'll say, okay, you have 2 hours to build these applications. And then we build something, we roll it out, we get feedback from the frontline workers, and then we incorporate that feedback. And by the end of day 1, day 2, day 3, you've got a pretty good solution in place that's solving a very real problem. And then comes the question of, okay, how do we want to add to this? And what additional functionality do we want to take on? What next line do we want to go to? What global KPIs do we want to collect in these systems? But you can have this modular sort of incremental approach, and every step along the way, you're capturing value. And every step along the way, you can sort of stop and say, okay, given the additional things we've learned and the progress we've made, where ought we go next? And we have methodologies for how we help people, work through this. But that's the basic concept. And, it's one thing to talk about it in theory, but this is what it kind of looks like. You go to an operation and you pick one little corner of the operation and you build an application, and those applications will most typically have a UI associated with them, a user interface. And why is that the case? Well, because we expect people to be interacting with these interfaces to be able to consume and extract the relevant context and information they need to inform their daily decision making. And we also need to capture information from these frontline workers in order to inform the state of the system at that point in time, and to be able to track these higher level metrics that we care about in order to run the operation successfully. But it gives you just a quick visual of what this actually looks like.
No, that's great. Thanks, Erik. I think, I'm just looking at the time as well, so we'll go through these pretty quick. We wanted to highlight 2 case studies, simple slide. We'll do it very quickly for the time being, certainly willing to follow it with anybody after the fact, but on how next-gen MES can actually be deployed and can set you up for success. So the first one that we're going to cover is a medical technology company. They were focused on evaluating MES solutions, traditional MES solutions. They ultimately decided to go with our technology, our frontline operations platform, Tulip, and really deliver full MES functionality that needed to be able to scale from when they were creating just a few units, to hundreds of units on a monthly basis. I think the real takeaway from this is you can see the applications that were built, very focused on making that operator more productive, more efficient, and quite frankly, just less error prone. But I think the real takeaway for us was they did this in, 3 times shorter time to value. So basically they deployed quickly, got value quickly. They built over 90 apps in a very rapid way using the methodology Erik noted to get them into production, and ultimately created a 100% paperless device history record system that they can now use as they ship these medical devices.
And Jason, if I could just add to that, it's also important to mention that this happened in a CFR 21 Part 11 compliant fashion. This is a fully validated line. So the methodology that I described in the previous slide is not, it sometimes can, it's not in tension with the requirements to operate in a validated space, which is a critically important thing. Now, if just briefly, some applications must be validated and have different levels of permissions and governments associated with them. Others are not a part of the digital history record and don't need to be validated, and they play more of a supporting role. And the point here is that you can do both of these things in parallel with the Tulip platform.
No, that's great. Thanks for that. And second case study, I'll let you cover.
I really want to make sure we save some time for questions here.
Okay, let's skip.
So let's go ahead and skip this. We can come back to it if that comes up in questions, but let's just get right into the questions here.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, thank you guys for a great presentation. And as has already been mentioned, we have quite a few questions. Okay, so question number 1, we are going to start with a comment and a question. I'm thinking about replacing my MES. How do I get started to make sure it's a seamless transition? I don't want to lose productivity in the process.
Yeah, Jason, if you don't mind, I'll take this one. many of Tulip's customers today have our position is the following. If you have an MES, great. You should, and if it's solving your problems, wonderful, great. You don't need to do a rip and replace if you're going to incorporate a capability like Tulip. If the MES is doing its job, oftentimes we think about separating these systems as systems of record and systems of engagement. What you would do is you could compose the approach and solution to be complementary to that MES system. So, Tulip is an open platform. You can integrate these systems pretty easily using a connector framework that allows us to transact data bidirectionally via REST API or via SQL query or SQL connections. But the point here is that a lot of times what our customers who have MESs that are working well will do is they'll keep the MES as the data structure and the backbone, and they'll extend the front end. They'll replace the MES front end with a Tulip front end, and that'll take this much more user-friendly sort of modular approach. But then the data will ultimately reside within the MES. Now, over time, what happens is you typically would develop less of a reliance on that data, on that MES data structure. So, totally optional. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's largely in your hands. But that's often what people will do. So you don't turn the MES off and turn Tulip on. You keep running the way you have it today, and you start layering on capability in a highly de-risked approach by starting small, with something as simple as a few stations, and then sort of expanding your implementation with Tulip as you go.
Yeah, and my only add to that, Erik, is I like to say we're an and solution, not an or solution, just to your point of not needing to rip and replace. We coexist in a lot of environments where we can help fill gaps, provide a better user experience, and again, just kind of augment what you may have as you consider tailoring to your next gen.
Okay, let's move to our next question, and it is, how are you seeing the evolution of hybrid architectures with IoT Edge? Do you see the cloud and low-code being able to bidirectionally control PLCs on the shop floor instead of traditional MES platforms?
I can kick it off, Erik, and please chime in. I would say that, from our standpoint, we're seeing, many architectures that are truly hybrid. There's a component that sits at the edge. There's some data collection. There's some data ingestion. There's some, execution that happens, quote unquote, at the edge. And then there's a cloud component that can, still run the majority of your analytics, your actual execution, using that data that's being collected, using it for insights across the enterprise. So, I would say what went from purely on-prem to some middle of the road hybrid to, full cloud. What we're finding, at least in our deployments and what we're seeing from the manufacturer we're dealing with, there's certainly a hybrid environment with a clear line of how do we leverage the cloud to the most part, certainly for the major set of processing, the major set of data storage, the accessibility of that data, and really being able to scale across an enterprise. But Erik, please chime in.
No, I think that summarizes it pretty well. We haven't mentioned explicitly, Tulip does have an edge device offering. We have a few different devices that exist at the edge as well that provide, these are physical devices that allow you to integrate sensors, machines, devices, and then do computation there at the edge on device, and then provide, classical example, if you're doing some sort of like high frequency monitoring, but you don't want to push all of that data back to the cloud, and there's like technical reasons why that's A, expensive, and B, sort of fraught with peril. You can do a lot of that computation there locally, and then take the output in the model data and send that back to the cloud. But it's also worth pointing out that these applications that you see in the pictures here, a lot of that, most of that computation actually happens on the client. So Tulip is cloud native, but we're a hybrid approach in that regard as well. So now that's the Tulip answer. If you extend that to, there's, I think, very legitimate tools that do sit on premise, a Historian, for example, or, there's all sorts of interesting data hubs that are starting to emerge. It may make sense to have some aspect of that functionality exist on premise for various reasons. Connectivity may be a concern. The frequency of data collection may be a driving requirement. That's all good, which is why Tulip is built, again, with this open architecture. So in those cases where that does make sense, it's not so important that you never think about doing that locally on premise. I think what's more important is that you don't limit yourself and have a trapdoor decision where you've forced yourself to do all of this on premise for all the reasons we've discussed. So again, the idea with Tulip is if that's working and that makes sense, great. You can take the output of that and send it back to a web native platform like Tulip to get the advantage of both topologies.
Yeah, I think, Erik, the only thing I would add, and you kind of nailed it, we're certainly not expecting that, all that data infrastructure that's in place, the PLCs that are in place, your HMI SCADA, maybe a historian, the things where you're actively collecting data, we look at ourselves as a platform that can leverage that data, again, to give it to the operators at the right time to make the right decision. And to Erik's point, there are solutions out there, industrial data ops, other ways to connect the data that are going to be, relevant parts of an architecture that help us consume data or supply data too.
Okay, thank you. We are going to move right along. And the next question is, how can we justify an ROI for an MES? It is often asked during meetings with management.
Yeah. Jason, if you want to take it. Yeah. And I apologize for the name drop, frankly, but I was like, Jeff Immelt is an advisor, an early advisor of Tulip. I was sitting down with him talking about this specific question. And he said in his tenure as CEO at GE, he spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and I quote, on MESs, and tough to say whether or not it ever saved him a dime. And it's not to say that they didn't. It is to say that it's a very hard question to answer, right? And a lot of the ROI exercises that we see being done, even like for folks who are considering Tulip, we have a fairly robust ROI methodology, and if you're considering Tulip, we'll work with you, and I think we have a good answer to these things. But the point is, if you're looking at an MES in a vacuum, it's very difficult. A lot of the assumptions are theoretical, and oftentimes the ROI calculation is a justification after the fact. It's not an actual requirement. I think the requirement is, look, we need it. We can't run our operation without this level of data collection. In some cases, we're being compelled by a regulatory entity. But all of the assumptions around efficiency savings and initial investment, and it's all theoretical when you're talking about something that's probably going to be delivered in the way you think in 18 months. It's a very difficult problem to answer for traditional MES. That is. Jason. Last point for Tulip. For Tulip, I would say do a pilot for next to nothing and have actual results and actual ROI, and then you can extrapolate those to the scope and scale that you would anticipate.
No, I think you nailed it. Where I was going to go with this is, I think when we think about traditional MES deployment, you're looking at a time horizon that makes it difficult to capture and calculate that value in advance. I've seen many deployments where you start in a site, you start to get some value at that site, you continue to build on, you get to site 2, it's a different set of functionality, different deployment cycle. You had expectations of going to site 3 through 10, you never get there. So I think the point that Erik made, which is we strongly believe that your next gen MES has to be iterative, has to be agile, and you have to just find a use case where there's value creation. You put it in, you capture that value, and then you move on to other use cases versus a big bang, multi-year. Until you do everything that you expected to do, you don't start seeing value.
Okay, terrific. We're going to move right along. As I said, we have many questions. This next question goes like this. What is the number one barrier you face when trying to convince customers to replace their old MES with newer solutions?
Yeah, let me take a first stab and then Erik chime in. I think that, the first thing that comes to mind is there's a sunk cost in those systems. There's expertise that was put in those systems, and it's hard to move on from something you might have spent multi-million dollars on over a long period of time. And there's a comfort with knowing that, hey, I've deployed this solution, I'm getting some value from it, my operators are used to using it. Yeah, it's not perfect. Yeah, I have some gaps, but I've got that sunk cost as an organization. And so for us, it's really trying to overcome what's already been sunk and looking forward and saying, yeah, but what else could we do? How can we become more efficient? how can we build additional use cases that perhaps you never targeted and get additional value for the organization? But I would say the number one thing I hear normally is, hey, I've already got something and it's a heavy lift for me to replace. Erik?
Yeah, and I would only add to that, I would, if it's solving a valid problem, I would never say you have to replace it. I would say, let's make it better, and let's augment those gaps. And if you, go back to one of the earlier polls where it says like the second most selected thing was there are gaps in functionality, right? Not that I hate it, not that it's not solving a valid problem, but there are gaps in functionality. So I would say, great, use it for the problems that it's solving. And then let's take those gaps in functionality and let's bridge those gaps by connecting to that system. So look, I would never try and convince somebody that has an MES that's solving a legitimate problem to abandon it. I think, there are other ways to address those concerns, and that's all about this composable approach that we're saying is going to be a key trend here. And we did skip over the slide a little bit earlier, but in closing, Jason, I want to hand it back off to you.
Yeah. So we put this slide up because as we're thinking about the MES market, we've certainly disrupted the MES market in a big way. We've kind of flipped it on its head with a different approach, a different way to build applications to meet the needs of manufacturers and operators. So as you can see from here, we were named a challenger. It's kind of hard to see on the small screen, but we're right there as the top challenger in the MES Magic Quadrant by Gartner. To us, it's validation that the approach we're taking is working, and that companies are securing value from deploying a solution like Tulip as a no-code IoT-enabled platform, to help that frontline worker.
Yeah, and in case the text is a little bit small here, Tulip is the top challenger in the on this quadrant here. In closing, I just want to mention briefly, thanks everyone for your time here today. We've really appreciated the conversation.